Welcome to Fitzroy Town Hall. My name is Natasha and I'm the library's programs, can you hear me? And events lead. I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people as the traditional owners and true sovereigns of the country on which we're here tonight, Yarra and Fitzroy specifically. I would like to pay my respects to elders past and present and acknowledge any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples here this evening. Just some quick housekeeping. If anyone needs the bathrooms during the evening, they're just over to my right and then to the right again. If you can please just check that your phones are on silent, that would be much appreciated. And to begin tonight's event, I'd like to welcome City of Yarra's Mayor, Councillor Edward Crossland, to say a few words.
Good evening, everyone. I too would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that we now meet on. I'd also like to acknowledge photographer and author Robert Ashton, CEO of Heidi Grant Books, Sandy Grant, novelist, poet and musician Greg Day. So once again, good evening everyone. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this evening where we're celebrating the launch of Fitzroy 1974 by Robert Ashton, a photography book that takes us back to the streets of Fitzroy in the 1970s. Originally published in 1974 under the title of Into the Hollow Mountains, this landmark book features stunning black and white images captured by a young Robert Ashton alongside original writings from local authors including Helen Garner. Fast forward to 2024 and Fitzroy 1974 offers an authentic record of life in one of Australia's most diverse inner city suburbs during a period of significant change. This book is a unique collection of over 100 images showcasing Robert Ashton's extraordinary eye for what made Fitzroy special in 1974. His evocative and compelling photographs provide a rare glimpse into one of Australia's most influential suburbs and a pivotal moment in history. From a historical perspective, the images capture the colonial roots of urban Australia, visible in the bluestone lanes and hard-cast pubs of 1970s Fitzroy. The suburb was vibrant with diversity as children of migrants found their place among the high-rise commission flats. The street serves as a sanctuary for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples. The cultural landscape, including Mother Teresa's Sisters of Mercy, the Divine Light Mission, the Greek Orthodox Church, Protestant nuns, student flophouses, and industrial sweatshops. Fitzroy became a haven for artists, musicians, writers, and photographers drawn by cheap rent, driving a creative legacy comparable to Greenwich Village in New York and Montmartre in Paris. The book also features beautiful writing from award-winning authors, including Greg Day, Tony Birch, Lorraine Clark, Helen Garner, and Damien Sharp. The diversity of the area is captured in the images and writing, showcasing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, multiculturalism, and the beginnings of a bohemian artistic population. Yarra City Council is proud to have acquired a suite of these works from the series for Yarra's art collection, currently in display at Richmond Town Hall, and many of which I find to be very beautiful and something that's very special to see when we're in the office. We are fortunate to have Robert Ashton and the writer and editor of the book, Greg Day, here tonight for In Conversation with the Book of the Era. After the talk, books will be available for purchase, as they have been earlier on, courtesy of Readings Books, and the authors will also be available for signing copies. Thank you all for joining us this evening, and I hope you enjoy the discussion and the opportunity to delve into the rich history and the culture of Fitzroy through Robert Ashton's remarkable work. So thank you all.
Thank you very much, Mayor. And just a warm welcome to our very special stars of the evening, Robert Ashton and Greg Day. To introduce these two great writer and photographer, I'd like to introduce Sandy Grant, the CEO of Hardy Grant Books.
Not sure I'm going to introduce them. They will introduce themselves in a second, but I will say some things on behalf of Hardy Grant and then pass to them. Look, I'm really delighted to be here to help launch Robert Ashton's book, Fitzroy, 1974. And as the Mayor said, it was published first in 1974 by a relatively, in fact, a very young Robert Ashton. And re-emerging now, it does stand as an insightful, revealing look at the essence of Fitzroy 50 years ago. But it does more than that. It brings us characters that were largely unknown and largely unseen to the page, and it brings us characters and scenes that are both really powerful and really intriguing. At Hardy Grant, we're very, very proud to be publishing Fitzroy 1974. It's a book that brings the era back to life. And as the Mayor said, things have changed dramatically in Fitzroy, but the characters and the times Robert captured remain the background for Fitzroy, maybe the essence that still underpins Fitzroy today. The work, I think, is a tribute to Robert. He was in his early 20s, and he managed to gain the confidence of the Fitzroy community. They let him into their homes, into their businesses, into their communal spaces, streets, and family life. And as you can see, they appear completely at ease. The photographer hasn't posed them, he's simply with them. And it's one reason the book is so compelling and so successful. And Fitzroy in 1974 was not an obvious place for Robert to be accepted. It was a tough corner of town, and somehow he connected with Fitzrovians, and I know some of those connections have survived and remain alive today with mutual respect, familial respect between Robert and others 50 years later. As the Mayor said, having Tony Birch, Helen Garner, Lauren Clark, Greg Day, some of Australia's most prominent authors contributing their writing gives the book some real depth, and it gives also contemporary context that makes the book all the more complete. Robert now, 50 years later, is a significant figure in the photographic community. His work's collected by many of the major galleries. He moved really from photojournalism, that this is in its own way, to photography as art, although this is obviously art as well. And if you don't know his work, I recommend you take the time to seek it out. From 1974, Robert's journey included opening one of Australia's first photographic galleries, Brummels, in South Sierra with his cousin Rennie Ellis. That gallery had a huge influence on a generation of photographers, and you can still see something of it now if you take yourself to the State Library, where there's a fantastic Rennie Ellis exhibition on, and part of that covering Brummels has Robert Ashton's insider comments all over it and on how the works were conceived and executed. Robert pretty much left the city in the late 70s, and his work since has covered a wide range of ideas, a wide range of subjects, and used a great variety of printing methods, making his whole body of work impressively varied in stone, tile, and content. I think, and Robert might correct me, the closest work he's done to the Fitzroy 74 is his brilliant and evocative work done in India over many years. As I said at Hardy Grant, we're really proud to be able to bring the book back to the market, back to life, and I hope it's embraced by the current generation in Fitzroy as much as it will be welcomed back into print by those that remember 1974. A final source of pride for me personally is that Robert happens to be my brother-in-law, and I've seen up close his commitment to his craft, his extraordinary knowledge of photography, and I do genuinely believe his work deserves all the public awareness, credit and recognition it gets. Capturing this era in this book and placed in such a definitive way is clearly one of his greatest achievements, and it's good now that we are able to make it available to historians, to the council and community in hardback covers for reference for the next 50 years or more. So I won't try and introduce Robert more than that. I should introduce Greg, who is a well-known poet, twice shortlisted for the Miles Franklin Award as a novelist as well, and a handy musician as well, and possibly a surfing friend of Robert's. But I welcome them both and invite them to take over from here.
Thanks, Sandy. Can everyone hear? Yeah? So, handy poet, handy a footballer, Sandy. Just like to mention that. Welcome, everyone, into this just amazing room. Cosmic Victoriana, we're going to call the ceiling. It's fantastic to be here for such a great occasion. Not your average book launch, not your average book. And great to be on Wurundjeri land, especially when the wattle blossoms reflected in the river at the moment. I was walking by the river today. That's always a great time of year. So, first of all, I'd like to say to Robert, congratulations on a great book. And we're all really happy and glad to be here tonight to celebrate it. So, well done, Rob.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
So, 1974 is a long time ago, really. And a lot has changed around these streets since then. I was in a pub earlier tonight and they were charging $5 for a single oyster. But I mentioned that to Rob before and he said, yeah, well, in 1974 you wouldn't have probably got any oyster, one or the other. And if it was probably Kilpatrick with bacon all over it. And so things have changed. And what I think we could do tonight with this conversation is just to jump into a time machine and just go back a little bit to the time of these images and to talk about how this book happened and how Robert, like a working class bloke from Pascoe Vale, came to be walking these streets and talking to these people and rendering these images. So 1973 and 1974 these pictures were taken. Yeah. 1974, I was 9 years old. I was reaching the peak of my football prowess for the Fitzroy Little League, as it happens. But you were doing something very different, Rob. And to get into the background of that, I want you to tell us what you were doing in 1971 and 1972 that was setting you up as the person and the photographer who could enter into this project.
Okay, so as you mentioned, that's better.
Yeah.
I was from Pascoe Vale, another working class suburb, not unlike Fitzroy. My brother went to art school and I thought, well, that sounds like a good idea. So I went to art school as well. I studied at Paran College for a few years. Moved over to that side of the city and got involved in photography. Well, my grandfather was actually a photographer, a street photographer in St Kilda, and I knew little about it. All his works were lost. They fell off the back of a truck after he died, but it must have been something in the genes. I got involved and did a photography degree diploma at Paran. There I encountered, who was a huge influence, Paul Cox, the filmmaker and photographer, Athol Smith, who was another photographer, a well-known fashion photographer, and they had a profound influence on me. Paul was your genuine European black-clothed artist, which I'd never come across before, so they really taught me a lot about the formal aspect and the aesthetics of photography.
Right, and so you, after you were in Paran, you were into that European sensibility of the integrity of the formal image and particularly in black and white?
Well, if you were involved in art photography up until the 70s, you only worked in black and white. Fortunately, that's changed, but that was the way it was then.
Yeah, okay. That was what was going down.
That was going down then,
Yeah.
yeah.
And so you graduated in 1971, and then in 1972 you went travelling. And I think this is a key kind of context for how you came to be taking these pictures in Fitzroy, as I understand it. So tell me about 1972.
So it was a sort of rite of passage, I guess, at that stage when you completed whatever education you were doing. You went off backpacking and travelling for a year, which is what I did through Southeast Asia, India, the Middle East, Europe. But I took a couple of cameras in an old plastic sort of satchel that I had and took photographs along the way. I took colour photographs, which I thought might be useful and I could sell in a photo library, but really my focus was on the black and white work. And I just roamed and learnt to look and learnt to interact with people. And so, yeah, that was a huge influence, and I exhibited that work when I came back.
But you were in Marrakesh, you were in Tunisia, you were in Algeria, you were in Portugal. Yeah. You weren't just doing London and Paris.
No, which you didn't those days. So nowadays you plot your itinerary on your phone, and there are people to meet all along the way. There you collected your mail every 3 months at the American Express, and you phoned home if you needed money. Other than that, you're on your own.
With a camera, in your case?
With two cameras,
With two cameras.
Yes, yeah. Which I left under a seat in a cafe in India where everyone had told me they're going to take everything you own. I forgot them, I ate, I left, and 10 minutes later some bloke came running down the street after me saying, "You've forgotten these." Yeah. So that kind of taught me a lesson about trust and people, which maybe carried through to the Fitzroy work.
So you came back and you moved into a share house in Paran with some people who were significant to this book.
I moved into a share house in St Kilda.
In St Kilda, right.
The infamous Mozart Street, which I shared with Ian McRae, who I think's here tonight, Carol Jerams, who became, arguably a pretty prominent photographer. Unfortunately died early, but did an amazing body of work, and Mark Gillespie, the musician. Yeah. So we shared that house together.
And so Mark Gillespie was involved at that time in starting a publishing collective called Outback Press.
So, yeah, Outback Press, which he started with Maurice Schwartz, Colin Talbot and Fred Milgram. They'd just started this publishing outfit, and their aim was to publish Australian content. And so it was Mark's idea and inspiration to do the Fitzroy book. And they also did the book called On Australian Women with Carol Jerams.
And they did a book of Australian women writing called Mother I'm Rooted, I believe.
They did,
yeah.
And a number of others as well.
Yeah. So this is the Whitlam era. This is, if we're talking 73.
Yeah, so things were pretty open-ended, creatively. Anything was possible.
Yeah.
So that was the feeling.
Yeah. So Mark Gillespie had this idea to do a book on Fitzroy, and he came to you and asked you to be the photographer. And was there any particular reason, apart from the fact that he liked your work?
I would say because I was there, which is the way a lot of things happened in those days. Carol was there, I was there, we were hanging around together. So he thought, he'd seen some of the work, but not a lot. He just thought, do you want to have a go at this?
And so you said yes, and there's no money involved or anything like that?
No money involved, and no real parameters. He had some ideas, he'd spent some time around there, he gave me a few leads to go here or there, but basically he just said go and see what you see. So I spent a year travelling across to Fitzroy and the Old Beetle, and spending my days just wandering the streets and seeing where it took me.
So in Tony Birch's fantastic essay in this book, he describes the lineage of photography in Fitzroy up to the point when you arrived on the scene. And it's a very stark kind of picture, which basically involves just social reformers and what Tony calls social reformers and religious zealots with a condescending, patronising attitude trying to save these poor people, the people of Fitzroy. But you came without that agenda and perhaps without an agenda in that sense.
No agenda. I didn't really know a lot about Fitzroy, but I'd spent that past year travelling all over the world, so I'd become more comfortable moving in all sorts of different milieus or places or whatever. So, and I also came with this formal aesthetic training. So I just went to see what I could see, and I would point my camera around, and I was always looking for the shot, I was looking for the composition, and I was letting whatever passed in front of the camera or whoever pass in front of it.
So one of the striking things about the book and these images, which, some of which were in Into the Hollow Mountains, the book that Outback Press published early days, but in this book, of course, there's many more images. One of the striking things, of course, is what they call in, I suppose, academic circles, the gaze of the people who are in the pictures. And there's not always, but in most of these pictures, the people you're photographing, well, firstly, they seem very happy a lot of the time. There's lots of smiling and kind of relaxed views. There's lots of interaction between people in a kind of jovial sense, perhaps with an ironic jovial sense. So there's this sense almost that you are not there as a photographer. There's a sense almost like it's an expanded family photograph album at times, even though you're bringing this formal expertise to the image, as you say. And that Mark Gillespie had this idea for, to document something.
Yes.
So tell us something about how that came to be. You're on the streets, you're with the kids, you're with the Sisters of Mercy, you're with the Koori community in the pubs. How did that come to be?
So I think it helped that I had no agenda, and it helped that I was sort of young and you might even say ignorant. So I was open to whoever I might meet, and there was a feeling of trust out and about which maybe isn't so evident these days. So I felt free and open to go and approach, and people said no, but not very often. Mostly they said yes, and one thing led to another. So the pubs were pretty scary places, so they said, in Fitzroy. I thought, well, how am I going to get into these? So I went into the Builders Arms Hotel, and there are a few First Nations people in there. It was a place for meeting. People welcomed me, they were warm, they took me under their wing. There's a pretty well-known family called the Lovitts in Fitzroy at that time, and a few of them were in that pub. They took me under their wing and said, you want to go to the Champion Hotel? Fine, let's go. So I had an escort and an armed guard, if you like. So that sort of thing happened on a number of occasions, which made the whole thing a whole lot easier. So the only time I ever felt even a bit threatened was in the Champion Hotel, but I was well guarded and there was no problem. But generally people, and I think you can see it in the pictures in the pubs and things, were happy and engaged. And it was an era before people worried about surveillance and
Yeah.
that sort of thing. So there was a certain innocence in that way.
Yeah.
People were open.
And it was also a time of, I started living in Fitzroy in 1984, I think, so 10 years later.
Yeah.
But in 73, 74, this was right on the cusp of this transition, which you can call gentrification, you can call the arts kind of kicking off big time in Fitzroy. And that's part of the book as well, that layer of, there's people like Danny Robinson, the musician that you're photographing, Joel Ellenberg, the sculptor, Sweeney Reed. So there's this layer as well that you're walking into the studios, early days, which, 10 years later when I rocked up, it was well and truly flourishing. So tell us about that as well.
74 or around that time, it seemed like it was a kind of a pivotal moment of change, because if you want to, for want of a better word, the old Fitzroy was just there and the new Fitzroy was just moving in. So there was a lot of action around the council flats, there was a lot of action in the pubs, in the cafes, the Greek and other European communities, the First Nations communities, your old style, original Aussie working class families. So it was a huge mix. The Sisters of Mercy were there, and so they invited me into their place. There's a funny story about that. I got into where they were, thanks Greg, they were helping a few of the less fortunate people there, and I took what I thought were some great pictures, took them home to the dark room in Mozart Street, which is a communal dark room, processed them, buggered it up for some reason. I wasn't very good technically. The processing was a mess. I threw it in the bin and left. Maybe half an hour or whatever later, one of the other residents went into the dark room to process some film, found the work, washed it, hung it up, and out came some of the more powerful images in the book from it. So I'm grateful for that. And the whole digital technology has helped me in that way. I might say that all the pictures are full frame and they haven't been fiddled with, but to the point where some of these negatives were scarred and broken, I was able to resurrect them. So that was good.
Yeah. So the book came out, Into the Hollow Mountains, and you hated the result at the time.
Yeah.
You didn't want to have anything to do with it. Tell me why you hated the result.
I don't think the publishers are here. So I was pretty young and naive. They launched the book in 1974. I went to the opening. It ended up chaotically. Someone came in, pinched a lot of the books, took them outside to distribute to the people of Fitzroy. The people that put on the opening ended up closing it down, so Outback Press said they were probably the only people that ever got thrown out of their own opening. But the quality of the printing was such that I'd been so drilled by Paul Clocks and the fine artists about the fine print, and these were like newsprint. So I really discarded the book and I forgot about it for many years because I was distressed at the printing. Now it's become this, it's a historical and a cultural thing, but in those days I wanted to see my pictures looking good and I didn't think they did. So I discarded it for 40 years, but then someone came to me maybe 10 years ago and found the pictures and said, let's have an exhibition, and which I had in the Colour Factory here in Gore Street, Fitzroy. And I started looking at them again, and other people started looking at them again. And so the journey to this book started.
And so through that whole thing, there's a sense now that you're seeing the pictures the way you want them, the way you were imagining it when you were given the documentary brief by Mark, but with your own formal aesthetic. Now you're seeing them in that way.
Absolutely. And I had the good fortune to be able to go back to all the original work and see things that I hadn't seen before. So this book is, hugely expanded from the first book. So I feel fortunate to have been able to do that. And I'm happy to see them now as I intended them.
And because these photos exist, and because of the nature of them, the tone of them, there's been great connections with people through them that have happened since then?
Well, that's been one of the other great things for me. And I'd have to give a shout out to Cara Rees, who's someone here from the council, she's involved in another project to put together a book of the First Nations people in Fitzroy. And she ended up tracking down a number of those people who are in my images and putting names to the faces, which actually meant an awful lot to me, and I made connections that I had never even thought about in the past. So the front cover of the book, the man in the front's a bloke called Cecil Coombs. His brother is Kevin Coombs, who was a very famous Paralympian athlete. And he saw the image of his brother just before he died recently and gave me a permission to use it, and that kind of meant a lot to me. And on the back cover is the strong man, and his name was Alan Lovett, and I was very fortunate to meet his son a couple of years ago, who's Alan as well, who also I was so pleased to be able to share his story and make that connection with him. And as a postscript, I was fortunate enough to take a portrait of Alan Jr. in the Builder's Arms a couple of months ago, just where his dad was. But it looks a bit different these days. That's where you get your oysters for $5.
Yeah, $5 oyster. Yeah. In Lauren Clark's piece in the book, there's 2 or 3 essays in the book. The last paragraph of Lauren's piece, she describes, this was probably last year when she wrote the piece, she describes walking home along Brunswick Street one night, and it's a bit quieter than usual, and she glanced up at the second story of a old terrace on Brunswick Street, and she saw a person sitting in the window frame. And she looked up, and she'd been immersed in your photos at the time. And she looked up, and in her piece, Lauren talks a lot about how the seeds of what she understands as Fitzroy, someone who arrived from Greensborough in the 90s, the seeds of that she can see in your photographs. Anyway, she looks up at this person in the window frame, and she thinks it's just like a Robert Ashton photograph. There's a stillness and a solitude, but within the community, always, it's like outside and inside, on the street, visible, and she waved and he raised his teacup to her. And I thought it was a beautiful moment because this isn't just a historical book, I don't think. The life in the photos, the energy of the people in the photos means that it feels like yesterday or tomorrow at the same time. And that's, I think, something, that we can say about your work in these photos, is that somehow you've managed to capture the solitude in people as well as them as members of a community on a street, in the people. And that's not something that you see every day, and it does kind of transcend time in a sense. So I think that's a great thing, and I just want to welcome everyone to applaud this book and just let Robert know that we're all here and it's a great achievement.
Thanks. Thanks, Greg, and thanks everybody for coming along. And I talked about the openness of the community back then and how things have changed, but maybe the more things change, the more they stay the same. So you could probably find the same things in a different way right now if you were a young bloke or a woman wandering the streets. It'd be interesting, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So to finish off, we thought it might be a nice idea if you were to read Mark Gillespie's, there's a little piece of writing, an edit from the original book, Into the Hollow Mountains. If you would read Mark's piece that is included in this book, he was the germinator of the project.
He was the inspiration for the project.
And he's no longer with us, Mark, so it would be nice to hear that now as a tribute.
So there was a lot of writing in the first book, a number of different pieces. A couple have been included in this new book. A lot of others haven't been. Worth a read if you can find a copy, but there's not many around. Mark wrote 2 pieces. One was called Mickey 1, one was called Mickey 2, and this is just the last paragraph, which sort of summed a few things up for me. He says, "But it's not all pushing a pram round Fitzroy, so Mickey and Bill decide to spend some time relaxing, getting away from the drab city at the residence of a musician friend, a violinist who plays with rubber gloves on. There's going to be music in the hills. The moving truck bounces along with the prams, armchairs and gramophone, Mickey singing and clutching onto his silver kit bag and safari hat, past the lamode stack and the spray painters changing the colours with every car, lizards. A perfect cheese truck whizzes past and they're gone. Further north, Norma, with her towering bouffant, jet black hair and stocking spider legs, leaves home in a tram that rattles up Brunswick Street, past the towers of Babel, the Ace Billiards Factory, the Rob Roy, and back into the Hollow Mountains."
Thanks, Rob. That's great.
Thanks very much, Greg. Could I finish by just saying a few thanks, which I'll have to read out. So I want to thank you, Greg, for the work that you've done and the support that you've given on this book. I want to thank Tony Birch and Lauren Clark for the great pieces that they've written. I want to thank Hardy Grant for finally publishing it for me, Pam Brewster, Todd Reckner, Kirsty Grant, Maury Schwartz and Outback Press for giving me the opportunity to start with, Mark Gillespie for the inspiration, Cara Rees for joining the dots, Laura and Alan for personalising things and telling me their story, and Jane for everything else. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.